Ed can be my publicity agent anytime, I tell you. My speech may be a flop tonight, but my visit is already a success because as we were leaving the hotel over here, the Capstone Hotel tonight, I got to see and shake hands with Nick Saban. And I saw Lane Kiffin. Back when we get back to Washington, D.C., Barbara and I can dine out on that for a couple of months at least. I must tell you, I was surprised when I was asked to speak here tonight. Usually when I come to Tuscaloosa, it's to talk about politics or tell stories about presidents I've covered. But tonight it's different. Tonight we're at, also, the other thing I do is I tell Bear Bryant stories, and those are always the ones that go over the best. But tonight it's different. We're in Foster Auditorium, for goodness sake. Foster Auditorium, this is a National Historic Landmark site in the struggle for civil rights. So what on earth am I doing here? After all, I was not a civil rights activist. I was a reporter, a journalist, and a journalist's job is to just observe and then report it. And on top of that, I never reported on any civil rights stories in my own country. I've only reported for the fight for human rights in other countries, other parts of the world, Eastern Europe, Africa, Asia. But I do have some credentials to be here because I was lucky enough to have been born in Montgomery, where the civil rights struggle really broke out in large measure in 1955. And I want to talk about some of the people on both sides of that struggle, people I knew. First, a woman named Ari. I've never known anybody else named Ari. Do you know anybody named Ari? It was spelled, an unusual name, I think, spelled A-R-R-I-E. I last saw Ari more than 50 years ago, but I will never forget her. In the mid-1950s, she worked for my family as a maid. She was African American. Ari was, I guess, about 50 years old, maybe a little older. She was an imposing woman, tall, erect, wore glasses, always dressed well, especially for somebody who did not make a lot of money. I don't know much about her home life. For the most part, she liked to keep her private life private. She was either divorced or a widow. I do know she had a daughter in high school. She was very well spoken. It was always clear that Ari was intelligent. If there's one word I would use to describe Ari, it is dignified. I've been around presidents, I've been around prime ministers and captains of industry, but I've never known anyone with more dignity than Ari. So let's set the stage. It's December 1st, 1955. Late in the afternoon, a very tired black woman takes a seat on a municipal bus. Her name is Rosa Parks. She works as a seamstress in a downtown store. She is also secretary of the local chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and I'm sure you all know her story. The driver orders her to move. She does not. She is arrested. She and others in the civil rights movement had wanted a test case in the courts to challenge the state law requiring segregated seating. The federal government had already outlawed segregation on interstate travel, but not on state or municipal travel. Black leaders wanted not only a test case, they also wanted to test the resolve of Montgomery's white merchants by putting economic pressure on the white establishment. Now let's look at what that Alabama law actually said. It basically said passengers had to sit where the bus driver told them to sit. But in actual practice, it was not necessary to do this. Whites knew the custom was for them to sit up front. Blacks knew they were supposed to sit in the back. But here is where it gets even weirder. There was no line on the bus separating whites from blacks. A clear line on the floor would have at least made some kind of perverted sense, but in practice, it was even worse. The custom was that whites, when they got on the bus, and if they saw that there were no seats up the front, they could go toward the back and go to the first row where blacks were seated, and a black person was expected to get up and move to the back and find another seat, or stand up if there were no other seats. Think about that for a second. How humiliating that must be. There's some students here I know tonight, and you English majors have probably read Ernest Hemingway's A Movable Feast. Well, this was a movable line, and Rosa Parks wasn't having any of that when the bus driver told her to give up her seat. She had already had a run-in with that same bus driver some years before, and so the bus boycott began. It meant that blacks stopped riding buses, which were their principal mode of transportation. It meant that many of them were not able to get to the white stores, white-owned stores, to buy things. It also meant that many domestic workers, that meant mostly black women, could not get to work. A young black minister was chosen to lead the boycott, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. And that brings us back to Ari. She told my folks that she was going to do whatever Dr. King told her to do. She said some blacks had formed some carpools, and she could get a carpool to take her to work in the mornings. But she said there was no carpool to take her home at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. She told my folks it was up to them to find a solution. And they did find a solution. Me. I had just gotten my driver's license, so every day after I got out of school, it became my job to drive Ari home. Now, time out for just a minute. How many of you have seen the movie Driving Miss Daisy? It won an Academy Award several years ago. In it, a black chauffeur played by Morgan Freeman drives Miss Daisy, an elderly white woman. He sits up front, of course, to drive. She sits in the back. That was the way it was supposed to be in the South. Blacks and whites were never supposed to sit together. It was a rule, not a law, but a rule, an unspoken rule, but a rule nevertheless. So when I would drive Ari, it was driving Miss Daisy in reverse. I was up front, Ari was in the back. That went on for a few weeks until one day, Ari and I were walking out to the car, and Ari stopped, turned to me, and she said, "Johnny, I'm going to sit up front with you. This is just damn foolishness what we're doing." I said, "Well, all right, Ari, whatever you want, it's fine with me." So we would drive first through a white neighborhood, and people would stop and stare. They had never seen this before. Then we would get to a black neighborhood where Ari lived, and even more people would stop and stare. And this went on for a couple of months. Then one day, Ari and I noticed no one was paying attention anymore. People had gotten accustomed to seeing us. The rule was no longer a rule. But there were plenty of other rules. Let me go back a bit to when I was about 10 years old. Down the street from our house was an elderly woman who employed a black maid. The maid had a son about my age, and sometimes she would bring her son to work with her. His name was Benny. One day, Benny walked across the street to the park where I played sandlot football with some other white kids. We asked Benny if he wanted to play with us, and he said sure. So, for several days, he joined us. But one day, Benny was not there. So we went over to his house and asked his mom, "Where's Benny?" She said she had left him at home and he would not be playing with us anymore. The woman she worked for had gotten a lot of anonymous phone calls saying we shouldn't play together. The problem, apparently, was that we were playing a game where we touched each other. We not only touched each other, we blocked and tackled and knocked the stuffing out of each other. It was football, after all. Apparently, if we'd been playing some other kind of game, like croquet, that would have been okay because there would be no touching. But we didn't play croquet in my neighborhood, so I never saw Benny again. One thing you can say about the Deep South in those days, it was like living as a character in a play by Beckett or Pirandello, the theater of the absurd. So back to the bus boycott and more theater of the absurd, that invisible but movable line on buses. When the boycott started, Dr. King and other leaders had offered a compromise. They said, put a real visible line separating black seating from white seating so that when the white section is full, then whites would have to stand up instead of taking seats from blacks. The white city fathers turned down the compromise. 1 year later, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that any segregation on city buses was illegal. There would be no lines, visible or invisible. And from December 1956, blacks could sit wherever they wanted. It was a total victory for Dr. King, but it did not come easily. Many blacks literally wore out their shoes walking either to work or to school. Houses were bombed. Dr. King and others were put in jail. Some blacks lost their jobs because white employers were vengeful. And some, like Ari, felt they might lose their jobs, but went ahead anyway. Once city buses were integrated, many whites, not all, but many, wondered, what was that fuss all about? The unthinkable had not only become thinkable, it had become routine. The same would happen 6 or 7 years later with school desegregation. I was just about to start Sidney Lanier High School when the Brown versus Board of Education ruling came down from the Supreme Court. I remember at the time some whites saying, the first black kid that steps inside Lanier High will be a dead kid. But that's not what happened. In Montgomery, black and white leaders worked hard to prevent violence, and they succeeded. Of course, many white parents took their kids out of public schools and put them in white academies, but at least violence was avoided. And not all efforts at integration were successful. When my younger sister, Mary Ann, was in high school, she heard Dr. King speak and was very much taken with the civil rights movement. I was already living up north. Mary Ann was and still is very religious. She's always asked, what would Jesus do? And so at the age of 16, she tried to integrate our church. One Sunday morning, she took the hand of one of Dr. King's closest lieutenants, the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, and walked with him up the stairs of the First Baptist Church in Montgomery. An ABC News camera crew was filming what possibly could be an historic moment, high drama, or so it seemed. But when the church ushers saw what was coming, they shut the doors, and one of them said to my sister, Mary Ann, does your mama know what you're doing? What's the matter with you? Go on home now. And so with the doors shut, she and Dr. Abernathy retreated in ignominious failure. No history was made that day. But I was proud of her for trying. And she was the lead story on the national ABC News that night. She later spent several years working with the SCLC and was firebombed out of the house where she was living in Knoxville, Tennessee. Of course, the first attempt to integrate the university also ended ignominiously. You're all familiar with Autherine Lucy, who was actually admitted in 1956, but was later suspended and eventually expelled. The university's flimsy excuse was that her presence endangered her and others. It was not a proud moment for the university or for those who loudly protested her admission. It took 7 long years before Vivian Malone and James Hood tried to enroll. Last year, the university, as you all know, marked the 50th anniversary on several occasions, and one of the speakers was former Governor George Wallace's daughter, Peggy. And you may recall that Peggy said she could never get her father to really give her a good answer as to why he stood in the schoolhouse door that day. Well, let's take a look at Wallace. He's a complicated person, actually. I first met him during his first run for governor in 1958. Some of you younger folks may not know it, but in that race he was the nearest thing to a liberal, or at least a racial moderate, in that race. He did well in the Democratic primary, but he lost in the runoff to a man, John Patterson, who was backed by the Ku Klux Klan. At that time, the Klan still had some experience, some influence. I well remember the first time I drove from Montgomery to Tuscaloosa. On approaching the Tuscaloosa city limits on, 82, the highway to Montgomery, one of the first signs I saw was, the Ku Klux Klan welcomes you to Tuscaloosa. Now, it wasn't that nice of the Klan. That sign stayed there for several years. And while I was a student here, I worked at a downtown radio station that no longer exists. In fact, the street no longer exists. It was the old Broad Street. Now it's University Avenue, the extension of it. I discovered one day that my boss, the general manager, belonged to the Klan. I was stunned. I told him, I've never heard you say anything racist. He just laughed and said, oh, the Klan. I just did that because it's good for business. I don't go to their meetings, but some of the Klan members have businesses that advertise with us. And the Klan was a factor in defeating George Wallace. He decided that in the next election he would play the race card, and he did, successfully. He was elected in 1962 as governor. I was a student at the time, having just come back after serving in the Army. I had been a student, went in the Army, came back. While in the Army, I was stationed at the White House, where I wore civilian clothes and worked for President John Kennedy's press secretary. My job was the technical one, to make audio recordings of the president for the National Archives and to deal with anything related to audio, such as microphones and public address systems, loudspeaker systems that the president used. I'm wandering off topic here, but I want to tell you about the night President Kennedy spoke to a pep rally here in Foster. The President and I were in New York at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, where Coach Bryant accepted the award for the nation's best football team. At one point during the banquet, the President, Coach Bryant, and I, along with some trustees and famous alumni, went upstairs to a suite where we had set up a telephone line from New York to right here to Foster Auditorium, where the auditorium was packed by students at a pep rally. President Kennedy got on the phone and he went on and on about how when he was a student at Harvard in the 1930s, he followed the exploits of the Alabama Crimson Tide. I was standing beside him, and I still have a picture of the two of us. I have sort of a quizzical look on my face. Frankly, I doubted he had spent any time at all at Harvard following the Crimson Tide. But the folks here at Foster loved it. Now let's move ahead a year later. I'm back in school here, and Wallace has just been elected governor. One afternoon, I was in class at what used to be the Union Building. It's now Pfeiffer Hall. The dean's secretary comes in the classroom and says, "John, you have a phone call from the White House." So I went down to the dean's office, and on the other end of the line was the gentleman who took those pictures at the Waldorf Astoria, the White House photographer, Cecil Stoughton. Cecil said, "I just saw a pal of yours walk into the Oval Office to meet President Kennedy and the Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy." I said, who's the pal? He says, "The president of your school, Frank Rose." I said that Dr. Rose and I were hardly pals, and he didn't even know me. After Cecil and I chatted a bit, I hung up, and then I called Dr. Rose's office. I smelled a good news story here. I was an aspiring journalist, and wouldn't it be great to break a story like this? I asked President Rose's secretary if he was in today, and she said, "No, he's in Houston, Texas, doing some fundraising." I said I didn't think so, that I thought he was in the Oval Office talking to John and Robert Kennedy. She said, "Just hang on a minute." It was more like 3 or 4 minutes, and then she came back and said, "Could I get over to the president's office immediately? The number 2 official at the university would like to speak to me." He was a very nice man named Jefferson Bennett. He said, "John, you love this university, don't you? You wouldn't do anything to harm this university, would you? But if you go public with this, it will infuriate George Wallace. If he knows Dr. Rose is meeting with John and Robert Kennedy to discuss how to integrate this school, Wallace will be very vengeful toward this university, and so will a lot of people in the state legislature." So I had to decide between my ambition to be a journalist and loyalty to the university. I think it was a close call for a few minutes, but I decided to keep my mouth shut. I graduated a few months later, so I was not here in the following June when Wallace made his famous stand in the schoolhouse door. Our master of ceremonies tonight, Cully Clark, is the expert on what transpired then. And if you want to learn more, I suggest you read his book entitled The Schoolhouse Door, Segregation's Last Stand at the University of Alabama. Cully has many copies of this. He'll be glad to sell them to you on the way out. As you know, Governor Wallace retreated that day, and the students were admitted. Vivian Malone is no longer with us. She died in 2005. Her sister Sharon spoke here last year. Sharon is a prominent doctor in Washington and is married to the Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder. When I told her I would be here tonight, I asked if there was anything she wanted me to pass on for her or Vivian. And she wanted me to remind you that her big sister's fight for civil rights did not end when she graduated from the university in 1965. Let me quote Sharon's remarks about Vivian. This is something Sharon gave to me to read to you tonight. The issue of civil rights was a lifelong commitment for her. From her first job in the newly formed Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department to her last job as the head of Civil Rights and Urban Affairs at the Environmental Protection Agency, she continued the fight for civil rights for all Americans. As a testament to the strength of her spirit and to her continued presence, the new administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency has established the Vivian Malone Jones Legacy Award, which will be given to an EPA employee who has made exemplary contributions to social justice. To ensure my big sister's safety and to protect her civil rights as a citizen of the state of Alabama required the commitment and active participation of the President and the Attorney General of the United States, John and Robert Kennedy. And today, my husband, Attorney General Eric Holder, has the responsibility and the privilege of enforcing those same civil rights. 50 years has brought about many changes, and although we still have much work to do, I think Vivian would be extremely proud of where we are today. Those are the remarks that Vivian's kid sister Sharon wanted to share with you tonight. The integration of the university was a milestone. That very night, President Kennedy went on national television and for the first time promised action on civil rights. He was the first president to say civil rights was a moral issue. Until that night, Dr. King and other leaders in the civil rights movement had been disappointed and frustrated by Kennedy's reluctance to push for significant legislation. President Kennedy did not live long enough to see his proposals become law. As you know, after his assassination, Lyndon Johnson managed to persuade a reluctant Congress to pass bills banning discrimination in housing, public facilities, interstate commerce, and perhaps most important of all, a bill guaranteeing the right to vote. At that time, white Southerners were very powerful in Congress. They warned Johnson, who was a Southerner from Texas, that if he continued to push for civil rights, then Democrats would lose the South. Johnson said he realized that, but he had to do it. Why did he have to do it? Well, partly he felt he had an